They say every storm tells a story, a narrative of pressure and release written in wind and water. I was a detective. I dealt in facts, not folklore. But the storm that night wasn't interested in my facts. It was telling a story of its own, and it had decided that I, Detective Harding, was its main character. I was running, not from a suspect, but from myself, from a case that had ended badly, leaving a bitter taste of failure in my mouth. My car was the only bubble of light and sound on a lonely mountain pass as the rain began to fall. It wasn't just rain. It was a torrential, violent downpour that turned the asphalt into a black mirror. Then my engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof. I was stranded. No phone signal, no signs of life for miles, except for one, a faint, warm light glowing through the sheets of rain. It was an old sign, its neon letters flickering bravely against the storm, the Penumbra Hotel. The hotel was a relic from another time, a grand, dark wooded lodge that seemed to lean against the wind. It felt less like a business and more like a secret. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside, trading the chaos of the storm for a heavy, waiting silence. The lobby was vast, dimly lit, and decorated with faded tapestries and hunting trophies whose glass eyes seemed to watch me. A few other souls were stranded here with me. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as the scent of wet wool and old wood. In one corner sat a young, beautiful woman with sad eyes, staring into a cold fireplace. Her name was Isabel. Near her, a loud, arrogant man in an expensive suit was talking heatedly into a dead phone. This was her husband, Marcus Blackwood. Arguing with him was his business partner, Arthur Vance, a nervous man whose face was a mask of stress. An eccentric, older scholar named Elias Thorne sat alone, buried in a strange, leather-bound book, seemingly oblivious to everyone. And overseeing it all was the hotel manager, Mr. Finch, a tall, gaunt man who moved without a sound. "The lines are down," Finch announced to the room, his voice a dry rustle. "The road will be impassable until morning, at least." Blackwood scoffed loudly. "Unacceptable. I have a meeting in the city. There must be something you can do." His argument with his partner, Vance, grew louder, their voices sharp daggers in the quiet lobby. I found a seat in the corner, content to be an observer. I was off duty. This wasn't my problem. Just as their argument reached a crescendo, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the entire lobby for a split second. And in that flash of white light, I saw it. A fleeting, impossible image. It was an aura around Arthur Vance. It was a deep, fiery red after-image of pure, unadulterated rage that clung to him for a heartbeat before vanishing. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. It had to be an illusion, a trick of the light on my tired, overwrought brain. A momentary madness brought on by the storm. I dismissed it. I was a man of facts, not phantoms. An hour later, Mr. Finch announced that rooms were ready. The tense group dispersed, each retreating to their own temporary cell. Blackwood stormed up the grand staircase first, his wife trailing silently behind him like a ghost. I found my own room, the silence of the hotel a welcome relief. I was just starting to unwind when it happened. The lights in my room flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging the entire hotel into absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy silence that followed was deeper than before. It was a breathless, waiting silence. Then, a woman's scream tore through the darkness from the floor above, sharp and terrified. And at the exact same moment, a deafening clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the old hotel. My detective instincts, buried under months of exhaustion, roared back to life. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from my bag. The hotel hallway was a mess of panicked shadows as the other guests stumbled out of their rooms, their faces pale in the scattered light of their phones. The scream had come from Isabel Blackwood. She stood before her suite's door, her hands over her mouth, her body trembling. "It's locked," she sobbed. "From the inside. He won't answer." I took charge. The door was solid oak. It took the combined weight of myself and Mr. Vance to finally break the lock. The room inside was dark and still. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, finding the source of the silence. Marcus Blackwood was slumped in an armchair by the window, his head lolled to one side, his eyes wide and vacant. There was no obvious wound, no sign of a struggle. On the table beside him was an empty glass and a small, overturned vial. It could have been a heart attack. It could have been suicide. But the locked door and the scream made it a murder scene. I was a detective again, whether I wanted to be or not. And I was trapped in a hotel with 4 suspects and a storm that felt like an accomplice. I interviewed them one by one in the grand, dark lobby, with the thunder providing a rhythmic, percussive score to their lies and half-truths. I started with Arthur Vance, the business partner. He was sweating, despite the chill in the air. He denied everything. "Yes, we argued," he spat. "The man was a monster, a shark. He was going to ruin me." As he spoke, another flash of lightning bleached the room white. And there it was again, clinging to him like a second skin. A burning, furious red aura of pure rage. "You hated him enough to kill him," I stated, my voice low. He flinched, but shook his head. "I hated him. I'm glad he's dead. But I didn't do it. I was in my room." Next was the manager, Mr. Finch. He was calm, collected, his hands steepled before him. He admitted Blackwood had threatened him. He wanted to buy this hotel, my family's legacy, and turn it into some soulless glass resort, he said, his voice laced with cold fury. As he spoke of the threat, a lightning flash revealed a different color around him, a deep, icy blue echo of fear. "You were afraid of him," I said. "Yes," Finch admitted without hesitation. "But fear does not make one a murderer, detective." I moved on to the widow, Isabel. She was wrapped in a blanket, weeping softly. Her grief seemed genuine. The lightning that flashed during our conversation showed the most confusing echo yet. A swirling, violet aura of profound sadness. But mixed within it, like a thread of gold, was a shimmering, undeniable echo of relief. My investigation was yielding more questions than answers. Motives and emotions were everywhere, but the facts were a locked room mystery. As I was pacing the lobby, the quiet scholar, Elias Thorne, approached me. He had been watching me intently. "Shh, you see them too, don't you?" he whispered, his eyes bright with a strange intelligence. The colors, the emotional residue. I stared at him, speechless. He explained, "This is not a normal storm. It's a rare phenomenon, a Karanos event." He spoke of folklore, of storms that temporarily thin the veil between the physical and the psychic world. "The lightning illuminates the truth of the heart," he said. "But be warned, emotion is not action. A man can feel rage and not kill." His words confirmed my own impossible observations. This wasn't a hallucination. It was my only tool. But it was a flawed one. The rage was real, the fear was real, the grief and relief were real. But who was the killer? I had to go back to the source. Back to the room where Marcus Blackwood sat, forever silent in his chair. The room was cold and still. The storm raged on outside, a constant, violent symphony. I needed one more look. I stood over the body, my flashlight beam tracing the scene, looking for the one detail I had missed, the one physical fact. I waited, my senses on high alert. The thunder rolled, closer this time. And then the lightning came, a brilliant, blinding flash. In that whiteout moment, I saw it. It wasn't on any of the people. It was a faint, ghostly echo lingering on the empty glass on the table. It was a sickly, yellow-green aura, an emotion I hadn't seen yet. The color of pure, triumphant malice. Triumphant malice, the color of a predator that has successfully trapped its prey. But the prey was Blackwood himself. How could a man's last drink be filled with triumph? The thought was a key turning a lock in my mind. The locked room, the vial, the motives he had so carefully provoked in everyone. It wasn't a series of clues. It was a script, and he was the author. I returned to the lobby. The remaining guests were huddled together, their faces pale masks in the flickering lamplight. The storm outside raged, a final furious act before its inevitable end. "I know what happened," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. I looked at Arthur Vance. "Your rage was real. He wanted you to be angry. He needed a suspect full of hate." I turned to Mr. Finch. "Your fear was real. He needed a suspect who was being threatened, someone with a clear motive to stop him." Then I looked at Isabel, the grieving widow. "And your sorrow was real, but so was your relief, the relief that it was finally over." They all stared at me, confused. "But none of you killed him," I said. "The only person in that room with malice was Marcus Blackwood himself." The final, brilliant flash of lightning illuminated their shocked faces as I laid out the truth. Blackwood was dying, not from a killer, but from a terminal illness. He was also drowning in debt. His life insurance policy was massive, but it contained a suicide clause. It would not pay out. So he orchestrated his masterpiece, his final, cruelest business deal. He didn't just die, he framed his own murder. He provoked everyone, creating a perfect circle of suspects. He ingested a fast-acting poison from that vial. He used a simple mechanism, a piece of string and a weight, to lock the door from the inside after he was already gone. His last emotion wasn't fear of death. It was the sick, yellow-green triumph of a man who had beaten the system one last time. Isabel began to weep, but this time it was the sound of a dam breaking. "He was a monster," she whispered. "He told me the plan. He said it was the only way to leave me with something other than his debts. He made me promise to scream." The case was solved, but there was no killer to arrest, just a room full of victims, including the one in the armchair. As dawn began to break, the storm outside finally exhausted itself. The thunder softened to a distant rumble. The rain became a gentle patter. A fragile gray light filtered into the lobby. The road would soon be clear. We would all leave this place. We would carry this impossible story with us, a shared secret that would never appear in any official report. Driving away from the Penumbra Hotel, I watched the rising sun burn away the last of the storm clouds. The world was returning to normal, but I was different. I had looked into the heart of a storm and seen the color of a man's soul. I understood that some truths are not made of facts and evidence. They are made of emotion, of echoes left behind in quiet, lonely places. Silence isn't empty. It's just a language most people are afraid to learn, so they fill their lives with noise. They avoid hearing what the quiet is trying to say. My job, my entire purpose, is to listen. My name is Arthur Kellen. I'm a private investigator, and I find people who don't just leave, they evaporate. They leave behind perfectly made beds, half-full coffee cups, and a void that swallows all logic. The police hit a wall, the families start to lose hope, and then, eventually, they find their way to my dusty office door. That's what happened with Mrs. Alcott. She was elegance and old money, her grief a perfectly tailored, expensive coat. Her son, Julian, a quiet university student, had vanished from his dorm room a week prior. No signs of a struggle. His wallet, keys, and phone were still on his desk. The police had interviewed his friends and exhausted all leads. Mrs. Alcott placed a small, clear plastic bag on my desk. Inside was a single, unlabeled audio cassette tape. "This was on his desk," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. The police listened to it. They said it was blank. I looked at the cassette. It was a cheap, generic brand, the kind you could buy at any convenience store in the 90s. It was the only things in the room that felt out of place. "Blank tapes don't exist," I told her quietly. She just nodded. My office is less of a detective agency and more of an audio laboratory from a forgotten era. It smells of ozone and hot vacuum tubes. I have reel-to-reels, oscilloscopes, and filters that can isolate the sound of a fly's wing in a hurricane. I took the cassette from its bag. The plastic felt cold and inert. I placed it into the deck of my Nakamichi. I didn't press play. I started the digitization process, converting the magnetic silence into a wave of raw data on my computer. To the naked ear, it was just what the police had heard, the gentle analog hiss of an empty tape. Shh. But I wasn't listening with my ears. I was looking with my eyes at the shape of the sound on the screen. I began the slow work of amplification, stretching the noise floor, peeling back the layers of silence like an onion. For hours, there was nothing but the random chaos of magnetic particles. But I am a patient man. My entire career is built on patience. And then I saw it. A ripple in the static. A pattern where there should have been none. It was faint, almost invisible. I isolated the frequency band. It was low, just above the subsonic range. I ran it through a series of noise cancellation filters. The hiss receded, and something else began to surface. A voice. It was a whisper, caught like a ghost in the machine. It was Julian's voice, distorted and stretched by the magnetic tape. But it was his. He was repeating a single, strange phrase. "Oh, where the sky is made of rust," he whispered, over and over. The words made no sense. It was a line of poetry, maybe. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. I went deeper, analyzing the space between the words, the texture of the silence itself. And that's when I found the second sound. It was almost completely buried under Julian's whisper. It was a sound I had to isolate and loop 100 times to recognize. It was a mechanical hum, a low, rhythmic, two-beat sound. A sound I had heard only once before, on a different tape, from a different case 5 years ago. A case about a librarian who had vanished from a locked room, leaving behind nothing but a similar blank cassette. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a single disappearance. It was a pattern, and the pattern was starting again. I pulled up the digitized audio file from 5 years ago. The case of Eleanor Vance, the quiet librarian who vanished. I layered her tape's background hum with Julian's. They were a perfect match, not just similar, but identical. A single repeating two-beat pulse. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of some forgotten patient machine. 2 disappearances, 5 years apart, linked by a sound buried in silence, and a phrase, "where the sky is made of rust." It wasn't a place you could find on a map. It was a description, a piece of dark poetry. What kind of place has a sky of rust? I thought of industrial sunsets, of the pollution haze over the old ironworks down by the shipping canal. I spent the next day in the city's engineering archives, digging through schematics of the old industrial district. I was looking for a specific type of machine that might produce that unique two-beat hum, An old hydraulic press, maybe, or a pump. And then I found it. A plan from the 1950s for a massive storm drainage station, built to pump water from the canal. It used a dual-piston pump system. Thump, thump. And the station was located right in the heart of the old ironworks. The place had been decommissioned for decades. It was a concrete husk in a forgotten part of the city. I drove there as evening began to fall. The setting sun hit the smog and industrial haze, painting the sky in sickly shades of orange and brown. It was a sky made of rust. I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. This was the place. The fence was rusted through. The entire area was silent, except for one impossible sound. Faintly, from deep within the concrete structure. Thump, 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 thump. The old pump was still running after all these years. My heart hammered in my chest. The main door was sealed shut with rust and time, but a smaller maintenance hatch had been forced open. I slipped inside. The air was cold and smelled of damp concrete and ozone. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. I descended deeper into the building, down flights of iron stairs that groaned under my weight, until I reached the main pumping chamber. It was a vast, cavernous space, and in the center was the machine. It wasn't just a pump. It was a colossal, ancient device of brass and copper coils, with a massive, slowly rotating antenna on top. It hummed with a low, steady power. It wasn't pumping water. It felt like it was pumping silence. And all around it, on the floor, were hundreds of audio cassettes. They were arranged in neat, concentric circles, like offerings to a dead god. My flashlight beam danced across them. I understood then. The machine didn't find these people. It called to them. The quiet ones, the lonely ones, the ones who already listened to the silence. It drew them here, and then it recorded them. It didn't take their lives. It took their consciousness, their stories, their very essence. It distilled them into a single, looping whisper, an echo trapped in magnetic dust. They had evaporated. I saw Julian's tape near the edge of the circle, and a little further in, one that had to be Eleanor's. What was I supposed to do? Destroying the machine might destroy them all. Leaving it meant it would continue its silent, lonely hunt. I realized my job was never to solve these cases. It was to bear witness, to be the archivist of the evaporated. I picked up Julian's tape and Eleanor's. I couldn't save them, but I could remember them. I could listen. I turned and walked away, leaving the machine to its patient, eternal work. Back in my office, the city lights feel distant. My work has a new meaning now. I am a librarian for the whispers trapped in the static. I collect the quiet tragedies, the stories that have been erased from the world of noise, and I listen. There's so much static in the world, so many unheard voices. Have you ever stopped to truly listen to the silence? I'd been awake for 36 hours when the first signal slipped through the static, but I wasn't chasing insomnia. I was hunting answers. 3 months ago, my sister Lena vanished without a trace, last seen boarding a train that never arrived. The police flagged her lost persons case before I even dialed their emergency line, chalking her disappearance up to wanderlust or teenage rebellion. I refused to accept their explanation. Driven by an urgency that felt like drowning, I raided every handshake she ever made, every late-night diary entry, every breadcrumb she left on social media. Nothing led me closer, until the night I uncovered her old shortwave radio, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her apartment. I knew it was an odd relic, but desperation makes relics feel like lifelines. I set the dial to a random frequency and turned the volume knob, half expecting only white noise and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Instead, I heard her voice. It was faint at first, strained by static, whispering my name and recounting a moment only we shared, our childhood ritual of jumping into the river at dusk. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be a hoax. Her tone, the timbre, the exact inflection she used whenever she was scared. My goal crystallized in that instant. Trace this broadcast, find Lena, and pull her back before it was too late. I scanned the dial methodically, marking frequencies, timestamps, and any shift in pitch. Each night, the messages grew more urgent. Snatches of conversation I never allowed anyone else to overhear, memories I'd locked away. The stakes became unbearably clear. If I failed, I would never see her again, and the radio's voice would fade into silence, leaving me with nothing but regret. I reached a point of no return when I discovered a pattern embedded in the static, a series of numbers that matched the platform numbers of defunct train stations across the country. No longer could I pretend this was a game. With trembling hands, I tuned the dial to the next coordinate, pressed record, and listened as the clock in my skull ticked toward a rendezvous that might break me or finally bring Lena home. I spent the next 3 nights hunched over the radio, scribbling down every static, cloaked fragment of Lena's voice and the string of numbers that surfaced beneath her pleas. I cross-referenced abandoned railway archives and realized those digits weren't random. They were platform identifiers for defunct stations scattered across the state. The first coordinate pointing to a rural stop 200 miles north. I packed my car with sleeping bags, flashlights, and the radio cradled in my arms, convinced that if I could reach that place before dawn, I might hear her voice live, unfiltered by distance or decay. The road was empty, the moon a pale witness as I drove through black fields that seemed to swallow the headlights whole. When I finally arrived, the station stood like a mausoleum, its shelter crumbling, rails buried beneath weeds. I climbed onto the platform and tuned the dial, and there she was again, her voice trembling, describing the scent of mold and rust, begging me to hurry. My heart pounded as I edged closer to the dark mouth of the tunnel, static crackling around us like a living thing. With every step, the radio hissed more urgently, Lena whispering that the train was coming, that the line was alive with something ancient. I shone my flashlight into the tunnel and saw the tracks gleam in the beam, disappearing into a void so immense I felt vertigo. It was too late to turn back. I could already hear footsteps echoing behind me, but they didn't belong to flesh and bone. My fingers tightened on the radio's dial as Lena's voice sharpened into a command. Find me. For the first time since her disappearance, I obeyed without hesitation. I felt the weight of the darkness press against my back as I stepped further into the tunnel, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the blackness. With each footfall, the radio trembled in my hand, Lena's voice now entwined with a chorus of distant murmurs that weren't entirely her own. She spoke of footsteps echoing behind her too, and every time I turned, I met nothing but endless steel rails vanishing into a void. My pulse pounded as trembling whispers, some pleading, some accusing, wove through the static, each syllable a clue and a warning. Somewhere ahead, the walls of the tunnel curved inward, and I realized the air was growing colder, heavier, as though the earth itself held its breath. I crouched to examine the ground, uncovering footprints pressed into the damp gravel, my sister's shoes, and another set, too small to be mine. A shiver ran along my spine as I crouched and traced those prints with my fingertip. Someone else had followed Lena here, someone who might still be trapped in this hollow underworld. I straightened and turned the dial again, hoping for guidance, but the signal splintered into an indecipherable drone. Then Lena's voice cut through, clearer than before. Find the lantern by the gate. It's the only way. A knot tightened in my gut. I remembered seeing mention of a rusted iron gate in the station archives, one that opened into an overgrown yard where travelers once waited for the midnight train. I pressed on, the path narrowing until I could barely squeeze between jagged walls, the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. The static spiked, and suddenly I was flooded with a memory I'd buried. Lina handing me an old brass lantern for our childhood fort, her eyes wide with both fear and excitement. My hand closed around something cold on the tunnel floor, and I shone my light down to find that same lantern, its glass cracked but intact, as if waiting for me. When I lifted it, the radio fell silent, and for a heartbeat I feared I had lost her signal completely, until the lantern's flame flickered to life, casting pale shadows that danced along the walls and revealing a narrow archway I'd missed before. Beyond it lay the station's old yard, twisted by vines and moonlight. The footsteps stopped at the threshold, and I realized I stood at the cusp of the unknown, equipped with only Lina's voice and this fragile lantern. There was no turning back now. Failure to press forward meant abandoning her to this subterranean prison forever. I stepped through the arch and into the overgrowth, the radio crackling once more with Lina's voice urging me on, and I swallowed hard, determined to chase her signal through the heart of the station's silent labyrinth. The lantern's flame trembled as I stepped into the overgrown yard, the hollow hum of the radio pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Vines curled around rusted lampposts and crumbled benches, as though the station itself had been swallowed by the earth. I paused by a shattered timetable board, its glass splintered like a spider's web, and wiped away the grime to reveal a scrawled note in Lena's handwriting. Follow the signal to the heart. My pulse spiked. Heart of the station, there had to be a central control room beneath the tracks, the place where signals once converged. I moved toward an iron hatch, half concealed by ivy, and with a heave it groaned open to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into blackness. The radio crackled, Lena's voice urgent. "Hurry!" My breath hitched as I switched off the flashlight and let the lantern's glow lead me downward. Each step felt as though I was wading deeper into the earth's memory, the walls slick with moisture that dripped onto my boots. Somewhere below, a rhythmic thrum began, a pulsing vibration that mirrored the static in my ears. I reached the bottom and found myself in a vaulted chamber strewn with antique relay switches and tangled wires, all coated in a sheen of rust. The room exhaled cold air scented with oil and decay. I lifted the radio to my ear. Lena's voice layered over itself, overlapping pleas and warnings. They're rewriting the frequency. Don't let them erase me. A tremor ran through the floor as the lantern's flame guttered. I strode toward the central console and brushed away a sheet of dust to reveal a faded photograph taped to the panel. Lena, smiling, next to an operator in a faded uniform. His face was obscured by shadow, but his posture was gentle, protective. Beneath the photo, someone had scribbled in shaky ink, "He brought me here." My blood grew cold. As the radio's static spiked into a low roar, the wires overhead hummed to life, emitting a pale blue spark that danced across the console. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and flipped the first switch. The lantern flickered as the chamber brightened, revealing a tangle of tunnels leading off in multiple directions, each marked by a decaying sign. Platform 5, signal tower, control loop. Lena's voice screeched through the static. "You must cut the main line at the tower, or I'll vanish into the silence forever." The floors trembled, as if the station resisted my intrusion. I realized then that there was no turning back. If I failed to sever the current, Lina would be lost to this echoing labyrinth, her voice erased. I lifted the lantern high, heart hammering, and stepped toward the tunnel marked signal tower. the only path to the final switch that could free her or condemn us both. I pressed forward into the twisting corridor, the lantern's glow dancing across coils of wire that pulsed with a rhythmic hum, guiding me to the base of a spiraling stairwell. Each step echoed with static until I reached the signal tower's chamber, where a circular array of levers and dials encased a single, massive switch at its center. The air felt alive, vibrating with the weight of every lost transmission that had ever passed through these veins of iron and copper. I knew then that pulling this lever would sever the station's hold on Lena's voice and on my own fate. The radio trembled in my grasp as Lena's whisper surfaced through the static, clearer than ever. "You're here. Don't let them rewrite me." My fingers hovered over the switch, heart pounding like a trapped freight train, the sheer force of the station's memory pressing against my mind. I braced myself, closed my eyes, and pulled. A wave of heat and cold spiraled through the chamber as the wires arced and sang, the lantern's flame flaring into a ghostly blaze. For a moment, silence fractured by a chorus of echoes. Lena's laughter intertwined with the frantic murmurs of past travelers, and then an almost sacred stillness settled. I opened my eyes to see the radio screen flicker one last time, and Lena's face appeared in the static, smiling with a bittersweet relief before dissolving into pure, wavering light. The station's hum faded into a distant heartbeat, and I felt its grip loosen. When I stepped back through the iron hatch into the overgrown yard, dawn had broken, painting the crumbling platform in pale gold. The lantern's flame sputtered and died as I tucked it into my coat, and the radio lay silent against my chest. I half expected the world to snap back into the ordinary, but I carried with me the weight of what I'd learned, that places remember us long after we're gone, and voices can linger in the spaces between frequencies. As I turned toward the empty road, a soft click came from the radio, followed by the faintest whisper of Lena's voice calling "thank you." If you found yourself drawn into these silent signals, give this story a like and subscribe to WhisperTales so we can trace the next echo through the dark together. Sounds never truly die. They just fade, becoming ghosts on the airwaves, waiting for a patient ear to tune them in. My name is Thomas, and as an audio archivist, my job is to listen to the ghosts of sound, the forgotten voices on old tapes. I work in the university's media archive, a quiet, climate-controlled crypt filled with the technology of yesterday. My nights are usually peaceful, spent in the company of crackling vinyl and the low hum of reel-to-reel machines. My current project was cataloging old equipment for disposal. Most of it was junk, outdated and broken. That's how I found it, tucked away on a dusty shelf in the back, not listed on any inventory sheet. It was a radio from the 1940s, a beautiful cathedral-style console made of dark, polished mahogany. It looked pristine. Its large, circular dial was marked with the names of forgotten cities and long-dead stations. It felt wrong to throw it away without seeing if it still worked. It was a piece of history, after all. I brought it to my main desk, the warm wood a stark contrast to my cold, metal equipment. I plugged it in. The large dial lit up with a soft, warm, amber glow, and a low hum emanated from the speaker. The old ghost was awake. I turned the heavy Bakelite knob, the dial gliding smoothly across the frequency band, mostly static. Shh. The familiar, comforting sound of chaos. But then, between two dead frequencies, I found a signal. It wasn't music. It wasn't news. It was a strange mix of what sounded like numbers stations and faint, fragmented classical music. And underneath it all, there were whispers, dozens of them overlapping, rising and falling like a tide. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It was unsettling, but I was mesmerized. I leaned closer to the speaker, trying to decipher them. Suddenly, the whispers and the music stopped. The static vanished. There was a moment of perfect, clean silence. And then, a voice cut through. It was a classic announcer's voice, calm and clear, like from an old wartime broadcast. "We interrupt this broadcast for a special bulletin," the voice said, warm and friendly. "A warning for Mr. Thomas in the archive." My heart stopped. It said my name. I looked around the empty, silent archive, my skin erupting in goosebumps. "The water has a bad memory tonight," the voice continued calmly. "Don't trust the pipes in the rooms below." Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the voice was gone, replaced by the soft hiss of static. I sat there frozen, my mind racing. It had to be a prank, a student broadcast, a pirate radio signal. It had to be. There was no other logical explanation. I tried to laugh it off, my hands shaking slightly. I packed my bag, deciding to call it a night. The archive suddenly felt less peaceful. I switched off the lights and locked my office. The only way out was through the library's basement level. The basement was a maze of old bookshelves and storage rooms, always colder than the rest of the building. I stopped at the restroom before leaving. The pipes in the old building always groaned and creaked, but tonight it seemed louder. I was washing my hands, the cold water a welcome shock to my frayed nerves. I was thinking about the radio's absurd warning. That's when I heard it, a loud groan from the ceiling above me, followed by a sharp crack like a bone snapping. I looked up just as a massive rust-eaten pipe burst open, sending a torrent of scalding, rusty water cascading down. It crashed onto the exact spot where I had been standing just a second before I stepped back. The floor flooded instantly. I stood there, soaked from the spray, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the broken pipe, steam hissing into the cold air. The radio's voice echoed in my head. "Don't trust the pipes in the rooms below." It wasn't a prank. It knew. I stumbled back from the hissing steam, my mind a blank slate of shock. The warning hadn't been a coincidence. It was a fact. In that cold, flooded basement, my world fractured. The line between rational explanation and impossible reality had been washed away. I didn't report the radio. How could I? I did the only thing that made sense. I smuggled it out of the archive and took it home. My small, quiet apartment became its new sanctuary. The radio sat on my coffee table, its polished mahogany dark and silent. It looked like a beautiful antique, but I knew what it was. A listening post on the shore of an ocean of ghosts. That night, I waited. The hours ticked by. I turned the dial, but there was nothing but the empty hiss of the modern world. The signal only came after 2 a.m., when the city's own voice grew tired. It was as if the radio needed the silence to hear its own whispers. I started keeping a journal, logging every broadcast. The fragmented music, the strange number sequences, the overlapping whispers. The whispers were the strangest part. They were snatches of conversation from different times, all layered on top of each other. A young woman in the 1950s worrying about a soldier overseas. A man in the 70s arguing about the price of gas. A child in the 30s describing a new toy. They were echoes of ordinary lives, all trapped together in the static. I became obsessed, spending my nights listening, my days researching. I was no longer an archivist. I was a student of the impossible. For 2 weeks, the calm, clear voice of the announcer did not return. I started to wonder if I had imagined him. Maybe the pipe was just a coincidence after all. Maybe I was just a lonely man losing his mind in a quiet room. And then one night, the whispers faded, the static cleared, and his warm, confident voice filled my apartment once more. "Good evening, listeners," he began, his tone friendly as always. We interrupt this broadcast for a public service announcement. I grabbed my notebook, my heart pounding. This time, the message wasn't for me. It was for everyone. A warning concerning the old iron bridge on Elm Street, the announcer said. A support sings a tired song. My blood ran cold. The Elm Street Bridge was over 100 years old, a rusted landmark on the edge of town. The final note will be heard this Sunday at high noon, the voice concluded. We now return you to our scheduled broadcast. The whispers and the faint music faded back in, but I wasn't listening anymore. I stared at the radio in horror. This wasn't about a leaky pipe anymore. This was a prophecy of a public disaster, a bridge collapse. People could die. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? Hello, officer? The ghost in my 1940s radio told me a bridge is going to collapse. They would have me committed. But doing nothing felt like being an accomplice to a tragedy I could prevent. The next day, Saturday, I drove out to the Elm Street Bridge. It was an old, beautiful structure, a lattice of rusted iron. To my eyes, it looked solid. But as I stood beneath it, I felt it again. The same deep, unnatural cold from the archive basement. The wind whistling through the iron supports sounded like a low, mournful groan. A tired song, just as the voice had said. I had to do something. I couldn't let people be on that bridge at noon tomorrow. But I couldn't tell them the truth. The truth was impossible. So I had to use a lie to save lives. My mind raced, searching for a solution. A solution that would get the bridge cleared, no questions asked. A solution that would also make me a criminal. That night, I sat in my car in a dark alley, a cheap burner phone in my shaking hand. My heart was a frantic drum. I took a deep breath, dialed the emergency number, and disguised my voice, making it low and raspy. There is a bomb on the Elm Street Bridge, I said, the words feeling like poison on my tongue. It will go off tomorrow, at noon. I hung up before they could trace the call, tossing the phone into a dumpster. I had crossed a line. There was no going back. Sunday morning was the longest of my life. I sat in my darkened apartment, the local news channel flickering on the television. My heart was a frantic, caged bird. The news was all about the bomb threat. The Elm Street Bridge was closed. Police helicopters circled overhead. I felt like a fraud and a felon, hiding in plain sight, praying I was right. The clock on the wall ticked towards noon with an agonizing slowness. Each tick was a judgment. What if I was wrong? What if it was all a delusion, and I had just committed a federal crime for no reason? Noon came and went. Nothing happened. The news anchors began reporting it as a hoax. I felt a wave of nausea and failure wash over me. I was wrong. I was insane. And then, at 12:03 p.m., it happened. The live camera feed shook violently. There was a deep, groaning sound of tortured metal. The old iron bridge shuddered, buckled in the middle, and then collapsed into the river below in a slow, graceful cascade of rust and ruin. There was a moment of stunned silence from the news anchors, followed by frantic, disbelieving chatter. My anonymous bomb threat was no longer a crime. It was now being called a miraculous, cryptic warning that had saved dozens of lives. I felt no relief, only a deep, chilling dread. I hadn't just prevented a tragedy. I had proven that my radio was real. I was no longer a passive listener. I was now an active participant in its strange, impossible world. That night I sat before the radio, but not with obsession. I sat with a feeling of reverence and fear, like a man before a dark altar. As expected, after 2 a.m., the whispers faded and the announcer's warm, calm voice filled the room. I expected a thank you, a word of acknowledgement. What I got was something far more terrifying. "The broadcast has been preserved," the announcer said, his voice as pleasant as ever. The final song of the Iron Bridge was quite beautiful. My blood ran cold. Preserved? Song? I stared at the radio, a horrifying new understanding dawning in my mind. The fear of the public, the shock of the collapse, the memory of the fall. It makes the signal so much stronger. It wasn't just predicting these events. It was collecting them. The radio, this entity, it didn't feed on electricity, it fed on stories. It fed on the emotional residue of tragedy. And by acting on its warning, I hadn't just saved people. I had helped it create a stronger, clearer broadcast. I had fed the ghost in the machine. The whispers that followed that night were different. They were clearer, and among the familiar, faded voices of the past, I could now hear new ones, the sharp groan of twisting metal, the shocked gasps of the news reporters, the splash of the falling bridge. The story of the collapse had been added to its eternal, looping library of sorrow. My library. Now I understand my new role. I am not just an archivist of old sounds. I am the unwilling curator of a museum of echoes. The radio still gives me warnings. A fire in a downtown theater, a fault in a subway line, small tragedies waiting to happen. And I am faced with a terrible choice each time. Do I let people suffer to starve this strange entity? Or do I save them, knowing that I am helping it feast on the story of their averted doom, making its signal ever stronger? I have become the keeper of the whispers. I sit in the quiet, and I listen to the tragedies of tomorrow. It makes you think about the stories that fill our own lives, the tales of joy and the tales of sorrow. Which ones will be remembered? Which ones will simply fade into the static of time? If you believe that even the quietest story deserves a witness, leave a like. It's a signal that proves you are listening against the noise. And subscribe, because there are always more signals in the dark, and I can't be the only one who hears them. A photograph is a captured ghost, a moment of light and shadow, stolen from time and preserved on silvered glass. My job is to give these ghosts a new life, to shepherd them from the fragile past into the digital forever. I am an archivist at the city's historical society, a quiet custodian of moments that are not my own. Last week, we received a new collection from the estate of the old Hawthorne family, one of the city's founders. It was a treasure trove, dozens of daguerreotypes and fragile glass plate negatives from the 1850s to the early 1900s. My task was to digitize them at the highest possible resolution, preserving every crack, every faded detail. I started with a street scene from the 1860s, a busy marketplace filled with people in stiff, formal attire. The original photo was small, the faces in the crowd a blur. But on my high-resolution scanner, they came to life. I zoomed in, checking the focus. And that's when I saw him for the first time, a face in the crowd. He was a man with pale skin and dark, impossibly sad eyes. He wasn't posing. He was looking directly at the camera. It was his gaze that was so unsettling. It felt contemporary, aware. I dismissed it as a curious anomaly and moved on. The next photo was a family portrait from the 1880s, taken 20 years later, a happy family on their porch. I scanned it, and again, I zoomed in to check the details. My blood ran cold. He was there again. Peeking from behind the large oak tree in the background was the same man, the same pale face, the same sad eyes. He hadn't aged a single day. The same suit, the same timeless sorrow in his expression. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. I began to hunt for him. I pulled out another plate from the collection, a wedding photograph from 1895. a crowd of smiling guests. And there he was, standing amongst the wedding party, slightly out of focus but undeniably him, looking right at the camera. I felt a growing obsession. I spent the rest of the day scanning image after image, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and discovery. A photo of the new city hall being built in 1905. The man was a face in a window across the street. A photo of a boating party on the lake in 1872. He was a silent figure on the distant shore. Always the same, never aging, and always looking directly into the lens with those haunting eyes. It started to feel less like he was looking at the long-dead photographer, and more like he was looking at me, as if he knew that over a century later, someone would be looking back, as if he was waiting to be seen. I felt a sudden, professional need to understand. This wasn't just a ghost. This was a historical impossibility. I left the scanner and went to the physical archive that came with the photos. It included a few old family journals. I found the diary of the first photographer in the family, a man named Silas Hawthorne. I opened the brittle, leather-bound book. His entries were mostly technical notes about exposure times and chemical processes. But then I found it. An entry from 1868, the handwriting frantic and shaky. It described a problem he was having with his photographs. "A pale man," he wrote. "He attends every photograph I take, but he is never there in person when I look up from my camera." I continued to read, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes seemed to see me through the lens itself. "I fear he is not just a witness to the moments I capture. I fear he is some kind of collector." The journal entry ended with a final, chilling sentence that made the hairs on my arm stand on end. "He is a ghost in their glass, and I believe that when he has collected enough moments, he will step out of the photograph and into my home." The journal fell from my hands, its aged pages whispering as they hit the floor. I wasn't going crazy. Silas Hawthorne had seen him too. A collector. The word sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a passive spirit. It was an entity with a purpose. My task was no longer just to preserve these images. It was to understand the ghost trapped within them. I turned back to my high-resolution scanner. My mission changed. I was no longer an archivist. I was an investigator. The photographs were not just records of the past. They were a 50-year-long crime scene, and I was the only detective on the case. I started looking for a pattern. Was he always near a certain person? A specific building? I spent hours cross-referencing. I realized he didn't appear at random. He appeared in photographs charged with powerful, raw emotion. A wedding, a funeral, the christening of a ship, the aftermath of a fire. He was drawn to moments of intense human feeling. As I stared at one photo, a winter scene from 1888, my office, usually a stable 20 degrees Celsius, suddenly grew cold. I could see my own breath fog in the air, a white plume in the glow of the monitor. The chill was so profound, it felt like it was radiating from the image itself. I clicked to the next image, a crowded summer marketplace, and for a fleeting moment, I heard it. The faint, distant murmur of a crowd. The sounds and feelings of these captured moments were starting to bleed through the screen. The glass was becoming a window. I knew I had to look closer. I pulled up the highest resolution scan I had, a formal portrait of the Hawthorne family from 1890. The pale man was there, of course. He was standing in the reflection of a large window behind the family. I pushed the magnification on my software to its absolute limit, zooming in on the reflection of the man's face. The image became a landscape of pixels and digital noise. I focused on his dark, sorrowful eyes, enhancing the image again and again. And then I saw it. In the tiny, microscopic reflection within the ghost's own eye, I saw something impossible. It wasn't the reflection of the 19th century room. It was the distorted, wide-eyed reflection of my own face. My own face staring back at me from across a century, captured in the eye of a ghost. The connection was real. He was watching me, right now. A wave of pure terror, cold and sharp, washed over me. I jumped back from the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to stop this. I tried to delete the file. The system asked for confirmation. I clicked yes. The file vanished. For a moment, I felt relief. And then, with a soft chime from my computer, the file icon reappeared on my desktop. I tried again, dragging the file to the trash bin. The result was the same. It simply returned, defiant. My fear was turning to a cold dread. I opened the image in my editing software. I would erase him manually. I selected the clone stamp tool, my hand shaking as I sampled a piece of the background, and clicked to paint over his pale face. The moment I clicked, my computer screen went black. The entire system crashed. The room was plunged into silence. I rebooted the machine, my hands slick with sweat. When the desktop finally loaded, I slowly opened the image file one more time. The image was there, but it had changed. The pale man was no longer in the background. He was now standing closer to the family. He was in sharper focus, and the look of profound sadness in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a look of cold, quiet, and profound annoyance. He knew what I had tried to do. I shut down the computer. I couldn't fight him in the digital world. He was stronger there. I had to go back to the source, the physical object. I went to the climate-controlled vault and retrieved the original glass plate negative of the Hawthorne family portrait. I held it up to the light, my hands in their soft cotton gloves. I examined every inch of the fragile artifact. And then I saw it. On the back of the glass plate, right behind the ghost's figure, was a tiny, almost invisible scratch. It wasn't damage. It was deliberate. I took a magnifying glass and leaned in closer, my heart pounding. Etched into the glass with a fine, sharp needle was a single, spidery word. It was a word that felt like a curse. Hungry. The word was a key, unlocking a new, more terrifying understanding of what I was dealing with. I had thought of him as a witness, a sad, passive ghost. I was wrong. A witness just watches. A predator waits. It wasn't just drawn to emotion. It was feeding on it. Weddings, funerals, disasters. A feast of human feeling. And I, with my high-resolution scanner and digital enhancements, was not just observing it. I was serving it a banquet. Each sharpened pixel, each restored detail, made the window through time clearer, making it easier for it to feed. Silas Hawthorne's fear wasn't just paranoia. The ghost was trying to get out. My work was helping it. I had to stop it. But how do you fight a ghost made of light and memory? A ghost that lives inside the very concept of a photograph. I dove back into Silas Hawthorne's journals, but this time I wasn't looking for sightings. I was looking for a weapon. I searched for any mention of folklore, of a ritual, of any attempt he made to fight back against his collector. I found it in his final, barely legible entry, written the day before he died of a sudden heart failure. He believed the creature was intrinsically linked to the photographic process itself, the flash of light, the captured emotion. He theorized that to starve it, he needed to expose it to an emotion it couldn't consume, a photograph of true, absolute silence. He had planned to create a final, empty plate, exposing the most powerful negative to a blank surface in a ritual of quiet intent. He believed it would trap the entity, not by destroying it, but by giving it nothing to feed on. He died before he could try. I now knew what I had to do. I had to finish the work of a man who had been dead for over a century. I returned to the archive late that night. The air was cold and heavy. The silence was different. It was a listening, hungry silence. The screens of my computers flickered with static. I could hear faint whispers coming from the darkroom speakers. It knew. It sensed my purpose, and it was fighting back, its presence a heavy weight in the room. I took the glass plate from the 1890 family portrait, the one where the ghost now looked annoyed and was closest to the foreground. I could feel a cold aura radiating from it, a silent pressure against my gloved hands. I placed it carefully into the enlarger, but instead of photographic paper, I placed a fresh, undeveloped silver plate beneath it. A perfect, blank slate, a mirror of nothing. My heart was pounding. I focused all my will, all my intent on the feeling of this archive, its peace, its silence, its purpose of quiet remembrance. I thought of a silence so profound it had no echo. I took a deep breath, and I hit the exposure button. A single brilliant flash of pure, clean white light filled the darkroom. For a moment, I heard a silent, psychic scream in my mind. The pressure in the room vanished. The whispers stopped. The cold dissipated. I developed the new plate with shaking hands. As the image slowly appeared in the chemical bath, I saw it. The ghost was still there, a faint, ethereal outline. But he was different. He was no longer looking at me. His sad eyes were now staring inward, into the blank, silvery void of his new prison. He was no longer a predator. He was just a photograph again, a captured ghost, pacified and contained. My job is different now. I am not just an archivist who preserves the past. I am a guardian. I watch over the fragile moments, the captured ghosts, and I protect our world from the ones that are still hungry. It makes you wonder. Every old photograph holds a secret, a captured moment of life. But what else does it hold? What silent witnesses are looking back at you from your own family albums, patiently waiting to be seen? If you believe some stories deserve to be remembered, leave a like. It feeds the good ghosts and keeps the hungry ones at bay. And subscribe, because there are many forgotten collections in this archive, and I need help standing guard.